And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's show, we're talking about the life and times and best hits of Pat Metheny. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of Pat's best albums of all time. The first album is called Trio 990, released in 2000. So, Pat Metheny is famous for his ability with the guitar. Through his many albums and solos and concerts, he's established himself as one of the greatest jazz guitarists in the world. This album deviates from the typical fusion style he's known for and takes us to a bop style. There's several peppy, upbeat jazz tracks in this album, also some of his own compositions. So overall, it's a great hard bop album. Pat Metheny is in top form as his solos, navigating blues scales with his mastery of melody and harmony. The rhythmic backdrop is also epic, with Larry Grenadier on bass and Bill Stewart on drums. The standout track in this album is Metheny's rendition of Giant Steps by John Coltrane. This track showcases his ability to play through complex chords. Also, one of his solos from this album, Go Get It, won him a 2000 Grammy Award for Best Jazz Instrumental Solo. The next album is called Bright Size Life, released in 1976. So this album is Pat Metheny's debut album with the Pat Metheny Group. It's a compilation of instrumentals. So this album features drums, guitar and bass music. Pat Metheny is on guitar, Jaco Pastorius on bass and Bob Moses on drums. The first two songs are Light and Relaxed, Bright Size Life and Cirebon, another song called Unity Village that's more melodic, Missouri Uncompromised, an up-tempo track. Probably the standout track from this album is the song Midwestern Dreams, featuring Metheny's impeccable guitar playing. This is one of Metheny's finest albums of all time. The next album is called The Falcon and the Snowman, released in 1985. So this one's a film soundtrack album, composed by Pat Metheny's band for a film of the same name. Music composed by Metheny and Lil Mays. This album features Metheny's fast-paced electric guitar melodies, and yet it's more of a keyboard-oriented album than a guitar album. Lil Mays is at his best here with his eerie piano and keyboard music. Also complementing Metheny's styles are some great stringed musical melodies from the National Philharmonic Orchestra. Another 1987 album release called Still Life Talking. This is the Metheny Group's sixth album, also won a Grammy for Best Jazz Fusion Performance in 1986. This is one of Pat's more refined albums. The tracks are rather loaded, but the atmosphere is ethereal. The cymbal sounds are fast-paced and peppy. There's many African rhythms like the song Third Wind. Metheny is at his best with his soothing electric guitar melodies. Lil May's keyboard is in the background with his keyboard music. His piano playing is light and complex, for example on the track So May It Secretly Begin. Mark Ledford's on vocals, and his singing synchronizes beautifully with Metheny's guitar playing on tracks like Minuano, Third Wind and Talk. There's electric sitar music on the song Last Train Home. A movie soundtrack type song called In the Distance that thrills with Lil May's floating keyboard melodies. And a beautiful piano and acoustic guitar mashup on the song In Her Family. Another album called Jim Hall and Pat Metheny 1999. This album was released shortly after Metheny parted with guitarist Jim Hall on his 1998 album By Arrangement. The album contains a mix-up of live recordings and studio tracks. The two artists complement each other beautifully as they perform a variety of original compositions, jazz standards, and improvisations. In these album recordings, Hall is on electric guitar, bringing a liquid, melodious tone to the music. Metheny plays several instruments in this album: an electric guitar, a fretless classical guitar, and his 42-string model guitar for some remarkable harp-like effects. There's a lot of variety in the music, in the tunes and the approaches. There's a hauntingly beautiful tribute track to guitarist Attila Zole called Birds and the Bees. In the song Summertimes, we see Metheny on rhythm guitar. There's also compositions by both musicians like Metheny's Bollard X and Hall's Cold Spring. Both artists are also avid improvisers. In fact, Jim Hall once famously recorded Freeform with the Choco Hamilton Quintet in 1955. And an album called Metheny Mildo, released in 2006. This one's for the most part a duet between Metheny and pianist Brad Mildo. Also, they are joined by Jeff Bollard on drums and Larry Grenadier on double bass on two tracks. On this album, Pat plays electric and acoustic guitars, and yet this album lacks the usual melodic themes that Pat Metheny is known for. Metheny's rendition of Travels in this album is quite outstanding. Are You Going With Me is a spectacular song with a steady rhythm. There's two-quarter tracks with bass and drums, and Make Peace, a beautiful duo track. The song starts off with a modest tempo, then zooms into fast pace, then back to slow and steady. So that was a compilation of Pat Metheny's top albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. Now for more promo news. The Newport Jazz Festival is one of the world's leading jazz festivals held on Rhode Island every year. The festival has a 70-year history, and over the years there's been several notable performances. Past performers include legends like Ella Fitzgerald, Nana Simone, the Duke Ellington Orchestra, and more. So, this year's edition of the Newport Jazz Festival is around the corner. The festival is taking place in Fort Adams State Park from August 2nd to August 4th, featuring some world-class performances as always. Specially priced 3-day general admission tickets go up for sale on Tuesday, April 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for 24 hours. Following this exclusive offer, full-price 3-day, 2-day and single-day tickets will be released for sale on Wednesday, April 10th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. For tickets, please visit jazztickets at newportfestivals.org. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Pat Metheny's greatest albums of all time. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's show, it's about the life and times and best hits of Pat Metheny. On this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called 8081, released on ECM Records in 1980. The music in this album is styled after the bop style of jazz, comprising swinging rhythms, momentum, and minimal chord changes. Overall, an adventurous acoustic jazz album. Another album called Letter from Home, released in 1989 on Geffen Records. This one comprises several previous tracks from other albums. The music also has an African and Latin ambience caused by the background percussion instruments like the melodica, the marimba, the pan flute and the accordion, among others. Another album called Imaginary Day, released on Warner Brothers in 1997. This album features fresh compositions featuring Mark Ledford and David Blamires on trumpets and vocals, also percussion instrumentals. A standout feature of this album is Metheny's use of the 42-string Picasso guitar, which he famously used to begin concerts. Another album called The Way Up, released on None Such Records in 2004. This album was Pat Metheny's last group performance before Lil Mays left the band, featuring Metheny and Mays joined by Steve Rodby, drummer Antonio Sanchez, and Richard Bono and Dave Samuels on percussion. The Way Up is an album that comprises the band's individual talents showcased in solo tracks. Another album called Orchestrion, released on None Such Records in 2009. The Orchestrion was actually a musical instrument machine that saw its origins in the 18s. So in this album, Metheny plays on the Orchestrion, an instrument that allows him to channel sounds of pianos, orchestra bells, basses, guitar music, and more. Unity Band, another album released on None Such Records in 2012. In 2012, Metheny formed a new band starring Chris Potter on clarinet, bass, and flute, Ben Williams on bass, and Antonio Sanchez on drums. So the Unity Band have toured and performed over several genres, from bebop to improvisations to vintage Metheny tunes and classics. And in this album, the Unity Band is a cross-section of all the above. So that was a quick recap of some of the albums we're going to be discussing on this hour, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. Be right back after that. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. Don't forget to check out my YouTube channel for archives of today's show on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's show, it's about the life and times and best hits of Pat Metheny, and on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called 8081, released on ECM Records in 1980. So, Pat Metheny mainly released records with his group, the Pat Metheny Group. However, he also sometimes released records with other outlets. In 1979, for instance, he was part of a band with Johnny Mitchell, himself alongside Lil Mays, Jaco Pastorius, and Michael Brecker. This one's a similar album release. In 8081, Metheny teams up with members from Ornette Coleman's band and Keith Jarrett's band, plus Michael Brecker and Jack DeJohnette. The music in this album is styled after the bop style of jazz, comprising swinging rhythms, momentum, and minimal chord changes. Overall, an adventurous acoustic jazz album. Another album called Letter from Home, released in 1989 on Geffen Records. This one's a great eclectic mix-up of music from Metheny. This one comprises several previous tracks from other albums, like tracks from his albums Still Live and The Falcon and the Snowman. The music contains beautiful cymbal music from Paul Vertigo. Pat Metheny's guitar playing on this album is one of the standout features, fast-paced and peppy. Lil Mays on keyboard sounds melodic and relaxing. The music also has an African and Latin ambience caused by the background percussion instruments like the melodica, the marimba, the pan flute and the accordion, among others. Another album called Imaginary Day, released on Warner Brothers in 1997. In the 1990s, Pat's schedule was at its busiest. He had several recordings to his credit at the time, for instance, recordings with Gary Burton, a trio with bassist Dave Holland and Roy Haynes, an orchestra album, and more. So, Imaginary Days is recorded around this time, with beautiful fresh compositions featuring Mark Ledford and David Blamiers on trumpets and vocals, also percussion instrumentalists. A standout feature of this album is Metheny's use of the 42-string Picasso guitar, which he famously used to begin concerts. Another album called The Way Up, released on None Such Records in 2004. This was the time Lil Mays dropped out of Pat Metheny's group. He'd become tired of living on the road, which was customary during Pat Metheny's band's tours. He was one of the lead composers of the band. That and the fact that he was their star instrumentalist with his beautiful piano playing caused the end of the group. This album was Pat Metheny's last group performance before Lil Mays left the band, featuring Metheny and Mays joined by Steve Rodby, drummer Antonio Sanchez, trumpeter Shuang Wu, Gregor Mary on harmonica, and Richard Bono and David Samuels on percussion. The Way Up is an album that comprises the band's individual talents showcased in solo tracks. Another album called Orchestrion, released on None Such Records in 2009. The orchestrion was actually a musical instrument machine that saw its origins in the 19th century. So in this album, Metheny plays on the orchestrion, an instrument that allows him to channel sounds of pianos, orchestra bells, basses, guitar music, and more. Unity Band, another album, was released on None Such Records in 2012. In 2012, Metheny formed a new band, starring Chris Potter on clarinet, bass, and flute, Ben Williams on bass, and Antonio Sanchez on drums. So the Unity Band have toured and performed over several genres, from bebop to improvisations to vintage Metheny tunes and classics. So in this album, the Unity Band is a cross-section of all the above. So that was a quick roundup of some of Pat Metheny's best albums of all time, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. We're going for a short break, be right back after that. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's show, we're talking all about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon Pat Metheny. We've come to an end of today's episode of the Jazz Update, so now let's recap what we were talking about. Pat Metheny first started out playing trumpet, then switched to guitar at age 12. By the age of 15, he was touring alongside big names in Kansas City. Then in 1974, he became a nationwide success in the jazz arena. His unique guitar style became apparent with his very first album release, Bright Size Life, released in 1975. He also pioneered several epic guitar types, from the 42-string Picasso guitar, the Ibanez PM100 jazz guitar, and more. So over the years, Pat Metheny has received acclaim not just as a musician, but also as a pioneer, an educator, and inventor. He's also won numerous awards over his career, numerous Best Jazz Guitarist Awards, and 20 Grammy Awards in 12 categories. His band, the Pat Metheny Group, have won 7 Grammys for their albums. Pat Metheny is also an avid international performer. His tours range from 120 to 200 shows per year. And that was a bit about Pat Metheny's biography. Now let's talk about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called the Pat Metheny Group. This one's his debut album with the Pat Metheny Group. Metheny is on guitar, Mark Eganen's on electric bass, and Paul Vertico's on drums. His compositions and guitar playing stand out in this album. Another 1987 album release called Still Life Talking. This is the Metheny Group's 6th album. He also won a Grammy for Best Jazz Fusion Performance in 1986. The next album's called The Falcon and the Snowman, released in 1985. This one's a film soundtrack album composed by Pat Metheny's band for a film of the same name. Another album called Orchestrion, released on None Such Records in 2009. The Orchestrion was actually a musical instrument machine that saw its origins in the 18s, so in this album, Pat Metheny plays on the orchestrion, an instrument that allows him to channel sounds of pianos, orchestra bells, basses, guitar music, and more. Unity Band, another album, was released on None Such Records in 2012. In 2012, Metheny formed a new band starring Chris Potter on clarinet, bass, and flute, Ben Williams on bass, and Antonio Sanchez on drums. So the Unity Band have toured and performed over several genres, from bebop to improvisations to vintage Metheny tunes and classics. So this album, the Unity Band, is a cross-section of all the above. So that was a quick recap of everything we were talking about on today's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. You can check out my YouTube channel for archives of today's show on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. And on that note, we've come to an end of today's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update. So I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.